This is Peter Walker from The Guardian, author of How Cycling Can Save the World. You're listening to the Group Ride podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 7 of the Group Ride podcast. This is a show that focuses on cycling in the greater Seattle area and beyond. I'm your host, Wes Salmon, and we got a great show ahead. In this episode, I chat with Peter Walker, a journalist for The Guardian UK and author of the new book, How Cycling Can Save the World. Then we check in with the Group Ride tip line to hear from listeners who called in with tips for the first-time Pacific Northwest bike commuter. After that, we take a look at some of the upcoming events in Western Washington. And then I finish the show off by looking at some of the reviews left in the iTunes store. Clip in, riders. The Group Ride podcast is rolling out. First up on the show, we have an interview with writer and journalist Peter Walker, author of the book, How Cycling Can Save the World. Thanks for joining us, Peter. You have a great credential list for both writing and cycling. So tell me a little bit about what you do in your day job.
Well, my day job is I'm a politics journalist for The Guardian newspaper. So I am based in the House of Parliament. I speak to MPs and all sorts of people like that. And cycling really is just a kind of side element of this. I also have the largely self-appointed title of editor of The Guardian's bike blog, which has been going for about 5 or 6 years. It was set up by me and a couple of other people, because we thought there should, as well as the kind of sports cycling coverage, we thought there should be coverage of everyday cycling issues, so commuting, bike lanes, safety, all that kind of stuff. So, but politics is my kind of main job, and I do the cycling whenever I get the chance.
So when did you actually start cycling?
Well, I cycled as a kid, as most people do, but then I went away to college. I didn't really do a vast amount after that. And I really, really got into cycling. I was about 22, and I'd left college and got a very secure, slightly dull graduate job. And essentially, on a bit of a whim, I gave up the job to become a cycle courier, which I think you call a messenger. And I was basically really unfit. I was really skinny. I'd not ridden a bike for about 6 or 7 years, and it was a bit of a kind of baptism of fire. But doing that for a couple of years just really, really got me into cycling. It got me into kind of realizing, not only the benefits that cycling can bring, but just the way it helps you kind of understand a city or a town and the way it kind of links to each other. So I got to know London really, really well. And I did that in London for about 18 months to 2 years, and I moved to Sydney and did that for about another year there. And then basically ever since then, I've just been really, really interested in, cycling and all the kind of various elements of it.
So are you a bike commuter these days, or do you do sportives, or do you do all sorts of different cycling?
I mean, I do various things. I've never been a particularly competitive bike rider. I've done mountain biking and road riding in the past, but I'm not particularly quick. I've taken part in races, but, that's not really what I mainly do. And I find that as I get kind of older, the kind of cycling that I do tends to be the more kind of everyday stuff. So even my kind of commute has changed from being 6 or 7 miles on the road bike with like having a shower at the other end, to now my workplace is about 3 or 4 miles away. So I just cycle at a sedate pace, wearing office clothes with my bag and a big basket at the front of the bike. So I'm gradually becoming more the kind of, European or Dutch style rider.
So your day job, being a writer and a political correspondent, you do a lot of writing. The most recent thing you've done is you've written a book called How Cycling Can Save the World. That is a very ambitious title. If you had to summarize how cycling can save the world, what are the things that we can do?
It's generally about how cycling can, maybe save the world. It's not kind of overstating it, but if you were being more accurate, it makes certainly towns and cities and places where lots of people cycle for kind of everyday transport. It makes them healthier, happier, more prosperous, more equal, various other things like that. I mean, there's a whole kind of series of things which kind of interconnect and make, kind of urban living based essentially around the needs of human beings and not, the needs of these kind of 1-ton metal boxes, which are often carrying a single person for a fairly kind of laughably short amount of time. So it's really about kind of recalibrating the urban world around the needs of people.
So your book has a number of really great chapters that cover different aspects of how cycling is evolving across the world in different cities. I'm based in Seattle, and we are up against our own struggles with both getting infrastructure in place as well as getting critical mass of users on the road. One of the chapters of your book is called If helmets are the answer, you're asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
King County, Washington is one of the largest counties in the country with a mandatory all-ages helmet law. And some feel that that is a significant barrier to people picking up cycling for those short trips, like 3 to 4 miles, where they don't want to wear spandex and they don't want to take a shower at the end. They also don't necessarily want to be burdened by other aspects of cycling safety gear that would slow them down or possibly get stolen. If helmets aren't the answer to the question we should be asking, what is the question we should be asking regarding safety?
Well, I mean, the kind of simplest answer to that is to look at the countries where not only the most numbers of people ride bikes, but also where the kind of safety stats are the best. So, for example, Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, to a slightly lesser extent. And in places like that, the idea of going out on a bike to cycle to shops or to work as if you're dressed up for a shift in like a nuclear power plant with the kind of, the kind of high visibility waistcoat and the helmet and the gloves and all the stuff like that, it just wouldn't make any sense really. And the reason for that is, as one person said, cycling is a fundamentally safe activity where the danger is imposed on people who ride bikes by other people. In this case, it's interaction with motorized vehicles, which kind of travel at great speed, and if they strike you, can cause, very serious harm. And so the best way to do it is to basically have an infrastructure system where people can ride a bike where they don't come into kind of regular interactions with vehicles traveling at more than about 15 or 20 miles an hour. And obviously, if anyone's been to the Denmark or Netherlands or stuff like that, it's fundamentally quite straightforward, but it takes quite a lot of kind of retrofitting.
Right. And we're struggling with that in Seattle right now regarding the retrofit because we have a lot of bike lanes going into areas that were built on a normal grid system where their width of the road requires that you remove some capacity, whether it be parking or lanes. And that really frustrates the road users who are not seeing the value of the cycle lanes being put in.
It's a very, very difficult thing. And weirdly, I mean, one of the things I found talking to people is that almost building the separated lanes on the busy roads is almost a kind of slightly easier bit to it. Because the other element, too, is it has to be a completely interconnected network, which means that on the smaller roads where, you can't kind of feasibly build a lane, you have to do things to basically discourage car traffic. So, for example, on kind of smaller residential streets, what the Dutch are very, very good at doing is blocking off residential roads so bikes can get through so cars can't. So, for example, in a Dutch town, to say get to the shops, it might be 5 minutes on a bike, but if you go in a car, it might take 15 minutes, and then it'd be very, very difficult to park. And so it's not stopping people from driving cars, it's just trying to gently nudge them towards the kind of easier option of going by bike. And that's the sort of thing that kind of policymakers in places like the US and UK and so on find really, really tricky.
Right. So back to the chapter of the book, the question it sounds like we should be asking isn't whether you should be wearing a helmet if you fall or have a collision on your bike. It's how do we prevent the scenarios in which you are possibly falling off your bike due to a collision with another road user?
That is kind of it. And it's a kind of slightly nuanced issue because whenever people talk about it, they say, well, a helmet makes you more safe. And, I tend to wear one when I ride around. I'll never discourage anyone from, doing so. But it's not the kind of main safety issue. I've got no problem, if people decide that's what they want to do. But the kind of issue is that in most countries, that is where all the kind of legislative and safety focus is. And, there's an argument for saying that bike helmets are probably not even in the 10 or 15 most important things that make a bike ride safe.
Right. So speaking of the other road users who may not necessarily understand that helmets aren't what keep us safe, but collisions or lack thereof is what we were striving for. Another chapter of your book is called The Out Group, Why Cyclists Are Hated. Yeah. As someone, I've had things thrown at me from moving cars at 50 miles an hour, so I can totally identify with this idea of cyclists being hated for some reason. How do we as a community, both as drivers, as cyclists, help overcome this us versus them struggle while we're using the roads?
I mean, the thing that I always say is that when people say, it's a war on the roads, it's us versus them, it's cyclists versus drivers, the whole basic premise of that, there's not really much kind of to it, because certainly in Britain, the stats show that of the people who are members of the main kind of cycle sporting group, about 80 or 90% of them also own cars. So it's not a war between different people. It's essentially the same people. And this whole issue of what, some people call the kind of subgrouping, that cyclists get called a kind of out-group, is quite complicated. And, some of it goes back to the fact that in certainly places like the US and Britain, cyclists are actually a fairly small group, so most people don't really know them. And those kind of attitudes tend to go away when you get more and more people riding bikes.
Right, especially if they're people that are riding bikes themselves, they quickly identify with the issues. But also when folks that know someone that rides a bike and knows kind of what they deal with, it starts to change their attitudes towards the normalcy of that mode of transportation.
And it is quite a tricky one because, I mean, the other thing is too that what you ideally want is a gradual shift away from cycling being seen as a kind of pursuit or a hobby or a sport or something you have to be a kind of fan to do. And again, moving to more to this continental European thing, where, for example, if you're Dutch, you would no more describe yourself as a cyclist, unless you were into sports cycling. But, if you're cycling to your job, you would no more describe yourself as a cyclist as you would, describe yourself as a wearer of a coat. It's just a kind of normal, everyday thing. And in a situation like that, where, even if you don't ride a bike, where large numbers of your work colleagues do, and, your friends also ride bikes, it kind of demystifies the entire thing and it just becomes a kind of normal everyday thing. And that's really the only way you can get away from this kind of outgrouping.
Right. And especially in areas where there's a lot of hills or a lot of bad weather, one of the things you typically run into when you commute to work on a bike, people, the first thing they say is, wow, you rode your bike today, or you rode your bike on that road. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's just another mode of transportation. And as opposed to them saying, you should be careful, I would hope they would start saying, I hope everyone is careful at the same time so that you can use the road in the way that you deem necessary, as well as other road users as well. So creating that, we're all simple road users with different modes we choose, as opposed to we are a hobbyist fitness group that likes to work out in the morning before I go to work. That's what I get a lot of times when I go to work, is that they're like, oh, you had a really great workout this morning. I was like, well, no, I just came to work.
Yes.
I may have come in really fast and I may be really sweaty right now because I had to climb a lot of hills. But I just came to work. That was the highest order bit of what my activity was about, and trying to get people to understand that is the key reason why we want people cycling, I think is critical.
And it's an interesting thing in a sense that the media has probably got something to do with this too, that when cyclists are kind of discussed as a group, they're discussed as this kind of homogenous mass. Even though I'm no more defined by the fact I occasionally ride a bike as I am by the fact I, sometimes take trains or the underground in London or drive a car. So there's this kind of grouping of kind of mass characteristics which cyclists have kind of supposedly got. But the other element is that when it comes to the cycle issue, the media debate is very much about what cyclists can do. Do they run red lights? Do they cycle too fast? Do they do this? And it's a very kind of one-sided thing. And it's difficult to change that narrative, and I guess it'll just take a certain amount of time.
One of the things that Seattle has tried, as well as many other cities, is to try to normalize more transport-specific cycling by creating a bike share or enabling a bike share in the city. Sadly, Seattle's bike share is going to be closing up at the end of March. Your book covers a number of different bike shares, both the successful versions of bike shares and as well as some of the less successful versions. As someone who's seen implementations across the globe, what aspects of successful bike shares are other localities leveraging that places like Seattle should try to embrace?
I mean, it's a tricky one because there's various different kind of elements which kind of work out why they become popular or not. But there's several themes which come out. I mean, the popular bike share systems tend to be one which are kind of implemented in a reasonably coherent way. So you always know that whenever you're in the city centre or whatever the bike share is, you're within maybe 5 minutes of a parking dock. So, I mean, for example, the London one has grown over time, and now more or less wherever I am, I can usually be able to find one in about 5 or 10 minutes. But the other thing too is bike share schemes have tended to suffer whenever you have a helmet use compulsion law. So, for example, Australia's got ones in Melbourne and Brisbane, and the stats show that they're amongst the least used in the world. I mean, the average New York or London rental bike gets used about 4 or 5 times a day, and the Brisbane ones, are lucky to be used once a day. And it's just the thing is that, these are a form of transport where you realise suddenly you have to get somewhere, and you don't want to plan it. And, they've tried all sorts of different things. For example, the Melbourne scheme, they have shops nearby which have, helmets for sale for $5 Australian dollars, which is not that much. Or at one point, they're leaving 1,000, free versions of them on bikes. And yet it's just kind of difficult because these are meant to be kind of public transport. They're not meant to be kind of, hobbyist thing. They're meant to be just turn up and ride. And so it doesn't always kill them, but it makes it much more tricky.
So yeah, I think the Seattle bike share suffered from a similar fate. The mandatory helmet system, where they had to create effectively a recycling system for people that wanted to ride but didn't own a helmet. They had to rent a helmet, and there was a whole mess of infrastructure required to clean the helmets and bring them back out and have them always available. It was pretty interesting how they tried to solve that problem, but sadly there were other issues as well with the bike share regarding funding, as well as choices of where they put the bike stations that probably all contributed to its final failure. But yeah, hopefully at some point Seattle can find a new way to create a method that people can pick up a bike even though they don't own a bike and use it for a couple miles here and there and really start to understand the value of that transport mode. Down in Portland, just about 180 miles south of me, they have a really booming bike share system and it's working out really well. So I think they have some ideas that we could leverage here as well. So hopefully we get that started up again in the next few weeks or a few years, actually. So that is some great information from your book. Your book is chock full of other really interesting stories, anecdotes, policy insights on how cycling is being embraced across the world, as well as areas where we've kind of fallen down in regards to infrastructure or safety. So I'm really excited for people to get your book that comes out next week. So if you want to give a quick overview of where people can get your book and when they can get it, that'd be great.
Well, it is out next week. It is published in the US, because it's published in Britain too, at the same time. It's out in the US on April the 4th, and it will be available from all the usual internet booksellers, plus hopefully lots of good bookstores too.
Very cool. And if people want to find you online, they can find you at www.theguardian.com. You write for a politics beat as well as the bike blog. And I believe they can also find you on Twitter at PeterWalker99.
Yes, they can indeed, where there's going to be a mixture of UK politics, which might be of less interest. But I talk about bike-related stuff too. Right.
Very cool. Anything else you want to leave our listeners with before we go?
Well, I mean, the kind of fundamental message I took from writing this book is that, I kind of characterized it at one point in the book is that, in a way, I'm kind of part of the problem. I'm someone who is a kind of real hobbyist bike rider. I occasionally get kind of bike-themed Christmas presents. I've got opinions about gear ratios. I'm the sort of person for whom cycling is very much part of my life. And what you really, really need is not so much fewer people like me, but a lot more people who take cycling in a very, very different way, who just see it as something which is just something they integrate into their everyday life, and they use it to get from A to B, and it happens to boost their health and make their city more livable and more fun. And that's really what the future is going to be. It's going to be less about the lycra and the spandex and more about just people traveling around and just enjoying it.
Totally agree. Totally excited for the ideas that are in your book to start seeing some implementation across the globe. And hopefully 10 years from now, we'll look back at this interview and think it's silly that we're talking about like how hard it is to build bike lanes, because in 10 years from now, bike lanes are the norm. So
fingers crossed. That would be great.
All right, Peter, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with the show today.
Pleasure. Lovely to talk to you.
Thanks again to Peter for taking time to chat with the podcast. If you want more information about his book or want to buy a copy, head over to thegroupride.com/how cycling can save the world. In last week's episode, I asked that riders call in with their tips for other budding commuters in the Pacific Northwest area. Here are a number of tips that came in through the tip line.
Yeah, this is Mike on Mercer Island. My suggestions for a new commuter are the following: is some fenders. Fenders work really well for keeping road water off your back and your legs, because you get more wet from water off the roadway than what's falling in some cases. Another one is have some basic fitness level. So take a spin class maybe if you're really not in shape at all. That really makes a big difference. And some wider tires deals with some of the uneven terrain, possibly in downtown Seattle if that's where you're commuting.
These are some really great tips from Mike, especially the ones about wide tires while riding in Seattle. There are a number of streetcar tracks along the roads, and you want to make sure you get the best chance not to get stuck in those. Wider tires will help you with that, but always take them at a perpendicular angle.
Hello, my name is Todd, and I recently spent 3 months in Seattle commuting by bike from Capitol Hill about 5 miles each day. And the biggest tips I could give as somebody who doesn't usually ride in the rain would be, of course, fenders, of which I had none until I moved to Seattle, and a raincoat. And my rain gear I found had to be breathable. First few versions I got, I think I was wet from sweat more than I was wet from rain.
Thanks for those tips, Todd. Hopefully you're back commuting in Seattle soon. Those are some great tips for those looking to start commuting by bike in the Pacific Northwest. Let's keep this trend running by having this topic carry over to the next episode. If you would like your tip read on the show, call our tip line at 206-651-4161, or you can email me your voice file at tipline@thegroupride.com. This week's topic is just like last week, your best tip for the first-time Pacific Northwest bike commuter. In previous episodes, I would take some time at the end of every show to go over the upcoming events in Western Washington to help you find great group rides. Now that the spring season is officially underway, the number of events every week is growing. Because of this, I'm going to change how I do the events segment. Rather than cover 3 to 5 area rides or races, I'm going to pick one event per week and discuss it. This week, that event is the Wednesday Night World Mountain Bike Races. This race series runs from April to August on most Wednesday nights. The races take place in North SeaTac Park, about 10 miles south of Seattle. While the race location is the same throughout the season, the course itself changes each week. The categories range from kids all the way up to Cat 1. By all accounts, this event is great fun with a party-like environment and pizza by the slice. Even though I'm notoriously bad at mountain biking, I'll likely give this one a shot this year. Registration is $17.50 online for adults and much cheaper for kids, and $20 at the door. You'll also need to buy a $5 timing chip, but you only need to buy it once, unless you break it. For more information about the Wednesday Night World Championships at North SeaTac Park, head over to thegroupride.com/Wednesday Night Worlds. To get caught up on all the events happening in Western Washington, go to thegroupride.com/events. And if you're organizing an event and want to get it on the calendar, let me know at thegroupride.com/add an event. In previous shows, I've asked for listeners to leave us reviews on iTunes because that helps others find the show. Here are 3 more reviews from last week. Cascade Man says, "The Group Ride podcast is a great new resource for Seattle cyclists. Wes has informative interviews with local personalities, as well as news and helpful tips on topics ranging from racing to commuting and policy. Keep up the good work, and thanks for adding a great new resource to the Seattle cycling scene." Flynn Bikes writes, "Seems to be geared towards cyclists, in quotes, rather than bicycles in general. If you self-identify as a cyclist, this is for you." Flynn Bikes makes a great point. While I do identify as a cyclist, mainly because I do wear spandex and I do try to ride fast sometimes, my goal with the show is not to just cover hardcore cycling. The goal is to cover bikes. The goal is to cover people who love to ride bikes. So hopefully this year, I'll spend a lot of time with people who ride bikes in ways that are not like me at all. That's going to include cargo bikes, crazy mountain bikes, awesome tandem bikes, a lot of policy talk, people who don't ever ride on the road, a lot of different options. So thanks, Flynn, for pointing out the fact that while I do identify as a cyclist, my goal of the show is to cover as much about cycling in Seattle, and that includes bike riders, as I can. Layback75 says, "Makes my drive entertaining. I don't get to commute by bike because I'm a sales rep that's tied to a car." Ugh, that sounds terrible. Anyway, this is a great podcast that covers a variety of cycling topics and is always entertaining. Thanks, Layback, and sorry you can't ride to work. If you'd like to review the show, head over to iTunes and search for the Group Ride Podcast. From there, hit the Reviews tab and let me know what you think. Thanks for listening to episode 7 of the Group Ride Podcast. This show works best when listeners get involved. So, just like last week, I'm asking our listeners to call into our tip line. The current topic is your best tip for the first-time Pacific Northwest bike commuter. You can leave your tip via voicemail at 206-651-4161, or you can email me your audio file at tipline@thegroupride.com. You can also find me on Twitter at The Group Ride Pod or on Facebook at The Group Ride Podcast. You can check out our website at www.thegroupride.com for podcast archives, some news, and an event calendar. You can always send me feedback about the show at podcastfeedback@thegroupride.com. Thanks again for listening to episode 7 of the Group Ride Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Salmon. See you next time.